Namaste. Welcome to Young Zendo, another sharing. I'm a history buff, always have been. Enjoy history, so let me give you a little history before I dive right in. But trust me, it's appropriate to what I'm going to talk about. I was first introduced to Zen, Zazen, from Japan, through D.T. Suzuki, Alan Watts, other readings. And I didn't really know much about it. I mean, it appealed to me intellectually, always did, because it seemed like a thinking man's philosophy. Even though that turns out to be the antithesis. But when I had a chance to go to a beautiful friend, Van Takimoto in Hawaii, recommended, he knew of my interest, and he recommended a dojo up in Kalihi Valley. It was Zen Buddhist, and he'd been there several times. They practice beginning meditation, and they also help you spend time in a dojo training for martial art. So it seemed amazing, and I started by going to some meditations. And as soon as you're done meditating, they lead you to the dojo, and the roshi would pick a martial art for you. You know, there was kendo, that's a kind of wooden swords. There was something similar, jujitsu or judo. And there was kyushu, that arrow. And the roshi looked at me and said, "Hey, you walk." There was a line from one end to the dojo down the middle of the mat, the exercise mat, just a straight line. And he said, "You walk one foot in front of the other foot, purposely and slowly. And when you get to the end, turn around." And this was my martial arts. It turned out to be Zen walk, and it turned out that he was really understanding, because the Roshi would feel you out and understand your personality and what you needed. And he thought I needed balance. And what I learned is that this walking, indeed, is the foundation for any martial arts. And something really interesting I learned later is that an adept at Zen walking could literally walk through a crowd without slowing down, purposefully, without slowing down, and seamlessly walk right through the crowd without pausing or stopping. It's as if the crowd parted, and I started to learn that he was in the frequency of the crowd. He was in harmony with the frequency. So, and also it had this added thing that nobody would see him. And I always longed to be invisible. I guess I was always pretty visible, because my whole life has been spent living where I'm definitely in a minority as far as racial extraction goes. All my life I've been a white boy in another world. And to this day, here I am in Taiwan. I don't know what percentage is white, but it's a fraction of 1%, let me tell you that. But anyway, this is where I gravitated towards, and early on I had no choice, because it was where my mother moved us. And I'm sure that neighborhood had a lot to do with her economic conditions. She was raising 3 children and didn't have a lot of money, and needed to have someplace close to work, but also affordable. And I was really fortunate at that time, because even in the lower, I don't want to say class, but in the poorer neighborhoods, education was excellent in California in the 50s into the early 60s. It was amazing. Quality education, private school level education. So I was really blessed to have a good education through the public system. And I don't know how Brent's not to hear, but my friend Van shared that dojo, Zendo, with me up in Kalihi Valley. And those of you know that know Oahu in Hawaii. It was a beautiful, beautiful location, peaceful, and went in and practiced meditation. And some of the things I want to share is that it's very Japanese, okay, that you would take your shoes off before you enter the Zendo. There's a protocol that you have to step to the right side or the left side and bow before you came in. And then you would go to a circle. There was a circle where the pillows were laid out, the meditation cushions were laid out, and you'd face inward and meditate with some instructions, some help, short meditations, maybe 2 or 3 20-minute meditations. And then they led you to the dojo, as I mentioned. So here I am walking, the Zen walk. And thank you, Roshi, to this day. Very interesting thing about this organization, which I learned later was Rinzai Zen versus the Soto Zen. And I'll touch on a few of the basic minor differences in practice. But the Roshi, the teacher, was a worker at Pearl Harbor. This organization did not encourage cloistering, separating, living in the temple. They did have a program, a 2-year program that would offer to people who wanted to become a monk in 2 years, but they still were required to live at home, keep a job. And the whole concept was us to learn to be a monk without a robe. I mean, it's really simple to put on a garb and and everybody knows you're a monk. But try being a monk without a costume, without cloistering. And my Roshi was a guy that you'd like to have a beer with, very personable. But of course, when he assumed when he put his dojo, we all wore gis. I'm sorry, in the dojo, we all wore gis, and we all had white belts. Even the teacher had a white belt, because they didn't believe in categorizing. Even though he was probably 7th degree black belt, everyone wore white belt, a commonality. And if you've ever been in martial arts, it's always kind of embarrassing to put on the white belt, and you long to get that first step up. And most of them, my experience was the yellow belt. Then you get little green tips on the end. Anyway, there was none of that. All equal. It's interesting tradition, and when we came in through the proper protocol, and we faced each other in a circle, and I was to learn that Soto Zen, you faced outward towards the wall. Rinzai Zen included, it was the Zen of the trends of the samurai, with the samurai code, Boshido code, and it included tea ceremony, flower arrangement, martial arts, in addition to the meditation. So it's kind of interesting where Soto Zen was. And it's interesting because they had different ideas about awakening, sudden awakening, which could take years, or gradual awakening. But, minor differences. But anyway, I got exposed to this tradition. And part of after you've progressed to a certain state, and the litmus test was, could you sit for an hour without moving? And I tell you, they were very, very strict in the really straight back. And it's close to a full lotus. At that time, I was able to sit in a full lotus, but an hour without moving, really strict. In the old days, they would literally hit you with a stick if you moved. And now, in a more modern time, they would metaphorically say, I will hit you with a stick, and it's an empty hand. But it's the same reminder that you're not sitting perfectly still. And I was a relatively young man, I think 33, if I'm not wrong. Not extremely young man, but I was a swimmer and I was a surfer and I was in very good shape, so I could sit. So once I progressed to that level of sitting still, that was again the litmus test. Could you sit still for a minimum of an hour without moving, with a straight back? Oh, and trust me, my back was I've always had poor posture, so it's really a struggle. I think my head's too big. My neck's not strong enough to hold up my head. Anyway, there you go. The Roshi would put on, he'd take his ki and he'd transform into a traditional garb, immaculate, beautiful. And you'd go into a small room and he's already there, and you'd approach with reverence and sit quietly until he spoke. And this is when he gave you a koan, a Japanese word puzzle that's not solvable through rational thought. The purpose being is to transcend rational thought. So it's like the classic one is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? I was to learn who is I, me, my? Who is I, me, my? Anyway, very ritualistic, and I received my koan. And we're sworn to secrecy, by the way. I'm not allowed to share that with anyone. And I honor tradition. And I've kept my... But what I want to tell you is that I never solved it, because solving it is using the brain, and I was really wrong. I thought that I'm intended to solve this somehow. And we'd have these opportunities to present ourselves. When we thought we got it, we went to the Roshi, and he would sit in the same solemn, small area, dressed to the nines in his ancient garb, and you would explain your koan, your puzzle to him. You solve it. And of course they go, no, keep trying. And this, I must have went 4 or 5 times until I got it, that, there's nothing I can say to him. The solution is not words. It's a training. It's a discipline to not depend, to appreciate the fallacies of mind-driven thought. And I got another koan just before I was ready to begin beginning my awakening process. And in fact, it occurred during this 3-day event. And I've spoken at length about but this was maybe amongst the first, and was concerning duality, opposites. And what I'm going to tell you how it was presented to me, and then I'll explain. It was reconciling diametrically opposed phenomenon. How could good and evil, right or wrong, be the same? be one. And this is something that you have to resolve. Diametrically means opposites, opposed, phenomenon, events, love and hate. And it began with picturing the yin and yang, the circle with half yin, black, and a perfectly fitted white, yang, and within the yin was a white dot of yang, and within the yang was a black dot of yin. How brilliant! And here we call it bagua. In Chinese, they call it bagua. How brilliant this concept was, because what it showed me, what I discovered, is that within the realm of the masculine, the yang, was a bit of yin, as well as within the realm of yin was a bit of yang. And this started me, so in other words, you can't have white without black. You can't have day without night. You can't have short without tall. You can't have love without hate. They're intrinsically related. You know, how would you, if it was always day, how would you distinguish? If it wasn't for night, how would you know? If it's not for unhappiness, how would you know what happiness was? Or if it wasn't for white, how could you imagine black? So reconcile means to figure it out. This is my koan. This is my ultimate koan that I can publicly share, that led me to a state where the real awakening process could begin. And it had to do, for me, it had to do with visualizing. I started with circles, but I found circles so limited because they're two-dimensional. So I started with spheres, okay? Sphere. Like a basketball or something. And realizing that what I dealt with was free will or destiny. And at the time, I remember thinking, okay, destiny. I'd look at destiny and say, you know what? I believe in destiny 100%. I believe in destiny. Everything's preordained. It's destiny. And then I looked at free will. And I said, of course, we always can exercise free will. So here I am, certain of free will, certain of destiny, preordained events, sequence of events. And I looked at them both and said, well, how could they be the same? They're diametrically, they're opposites, polar opposites, right? Polar would be this way. Okay. Polar opposites. And when I started considering the fact that, or the possibility that they might be the part and parcel of the same thing, my mind literally exploded. And it was only till my mind exploded that I could get it. Say, yes, it's a sphere. Happiness and sadness are on different parts of the same sphere. And there's degrees of unhappiness, there's degrees of happiness. And it's not duality, which not duality means non-duality. There's just one. So it was so hard. Like I said, my mind exploded. I looked for the brain mass on the floor because it just literally exploded severely. Entertaining this idea just caused my brain, and that was kind of it's time for no thinking. No thing, nothing. And when I got it, it seemed so simple. Of course, there's a how else? What else could it seemed so simple to me? Really simple. The process was painstakingly painful. if that's if that's if I can string those two words together, painstakingly painful. Only to get to a point where I just, oh my God. And I started laughing. And this is the great Buddha belly laugh. And this leads you to a state. And I laughed. It seemed like hours because this process took days in linear time. I was in the space-time continuum. So linear time meant little to me except that I know that 3 days passed without going to the toilet, without eating, without sleeping. The better part of 3 days. 2 days and a fraction, okay? That sounds more doable. But it was still, didn't matter because it was as if time stood still. And it's the only artificial, the calendar, the clock that had any ways of measurement that would make sense to a rational mind. Because this is totally irrational. And that's the point. To destroy rationality. To recognize that rationality only supports separation and division, and that irrationality is what would allow you to even begin the entertainment of opposites being part and parcel of the same thing. Good karma, bad karma, how's that? They're the same. Okay, so belly laugh lasted for hours and hours and hours. And then I found myself, my laughter slowly morphed into tears. I laughed so hard that I cried. But then that crying became a catharsis. It's a cleansing. I just let it all out. It was mourning. This is when the ego, it was mourning, mourning, to mourn. It was mourning the loss, the death of my ego, which is, after all, what I thought I was. And it was no more impactful than me then mourning a death, a physical death. So I cried and I cried and I cried. And when there were, when the tears dry up, when there's no more tears to cry, I moved into the next thing I can remember was this idea of being exposed to all my past lives. Okay, and that's enough of that because I'm talking about Koan. So the last Koan that I had to solve that led to the beginning, the first step in awakening was to reconcile diametrically opposed phenomena. And I love those words. I repeat them, and my non-native English speaker. It just means opposites. To reconcile means to make your mind, to fit your mind, to wrap your mind around the idea of, to really understand non-duality, the oneness. When we lived and trained and taught and nurtured in this environment of duality, us and them, separation. This is me looking out instead of me looking in. Inwards. So I'm sharing this because this is my experience and this is my koan, and this is the koan that really was my true koan. It's not the one the Roshi gave me, but this is the one that was the most instrumental when I finally understood what a koan was, and more importantly, what it wasn't. Isn't that funny that sometimes it's more important to understand? Maybe you begin your understanding by knowing what is not so. And then you can start looking for the remnants, the scraps, the leftovers, for what may be so. And then, of course, you have to evaluate them. You have to ruminate. You have to reflect on them. And you need to find the nuggets of wisdom from the nuggets of gold from wisdom from knowledge, that become wisdom. And then once you have this wisdom, so you start off by accumulating, sorting, and then you have to evaluation. And after you evaluate, then you have to store. And most importantly, you have to create a system to file so that you can retrieve them. I always say, and I'll say it again, I know everything I need to know when I need to know it. And if I don't know it, I don't need to know it. It's available. And that was another step, going into the halls of Alexandria, where all the information, all the knowledge poured into me. Where I knew, for a certain length of time, I knew everything that was known, is known, can be known, or will be known. I knew it all, however briefly. And something I want to share at this point is that recently the three Buddhas, the beloved, the process of loving, and the beloved, the lover, is when your heart expands with the grain, the compassion. That's the first Buddha. The second Buddha is the process of loving, which is the Dharma. Dharma just means teaching. This is the wordless teaching that can only be expressed by your demeanor, by your personality, and those sensitive enough, you're inshinging, you're sending that information on the coconut wireless, we call it in Hawaii. No words, wordless information, and those that are tuned in can receive it. But it doesn't, no matter if no one's tuned in, it doesn't stop you from transmitting. So the process of loving is to become a living example of the Dharma, of the teachings, of Buddha's teachings. And the third step is the beloved, and that's when Buddha, the historical Shakyamuni, Siddhartha, comes and sits with you. And he came and he kept my blue Buddha, which has been between I've spoken of my blue Buddha, who asked for permission to be between my heart, the green of my heart, and the blue of my throat. And with the purpose, this is the blue Buddha in the Tibetan tradition is the medical Buddha. And that means that this Buddha was attempting to transmit from my heart to my mouth the healing, so that my words would actually have a healing capability. And basically, I've always seen myself as sort of a psychological rather than a physical healer. I deal in the realms of emotion, the realms of misguided thinking, misguided expectations, unrealistic expectations of oneself. But now, the man himself came and sat within me. And this was June 20th this year, only a few months ago. The lover, the first Buddha, was 8 years ago after the awakening process. The Dharma, the process of loving, the Dharma, the teachings, took another 2 years or 3 years of maturity. You have to mature as a Buddha. And it wasn't for 2 or 3 years, and really only the last few years, out of 8, I guess it is, that where I felt compelled to share. But this last step, let me put it in the process. First of all, I started getting mathematical 1/10,000th of the population of 7.8 billion people. 1/10,000th. That's 0.00001. This is the awakened spirit on this earth. 7,800 fully awakened, aware teachers, Buddhas, gurus, roshis, sifus, sensei, whatever you want to call it. 7,800 awakened. And at the same time, I got the message that 1/1000th, which is 0.0001, which is, the number is 780 million. There's 780 million souls out of 7.8 billion that are ready to receive the Dharma, to begin the serious work of remembering the forgotten, the amazing discovery of what is so, and that it's always been so, and that all of us are Buddhas, and all of us are just in different stages of slumber. So 7,800, very specific. And I'm not a math guy, okay? Very, very specific, given to me, with 780 million. That means, doesn't it mean like 100 for every awakened? But you know, the majority of awakened people don't make the choice to teach. You'll never even, unless you're extremely sensitive, you'll never even be aware of them. You'll be aware of their presence, but you can't specifically say who you're experiencing, because this is their choice. They continue their self, because this is a never-ending process, right? It just goes infinitely, doesn't stop. But others feel compelled, and I remember my Sifu asking me, would I dedicate myself, when I reach Buddhahood, would I dedicate myself to working towards the enlightenment of all sentient beings? And that I promised him I would, and I promised him because it felt correct. And I've been doing my part these last 4 years with my YouTube videos. I have a small group that we mastermind, that we share, small group with the same interest, to escape samsara, to escape suffering. We all are together in this dream. Wake up.